You lied to me about everything, Clara screamed, staring at the mansion rising from the valley floor. Caleb didn't move. I never lied, he said quietly. I just never told you. She backed away, hands trembling. You let me marry a poor cowboy. You let me believe we'd starve together. His eyes didn't waver. Because I needed to know if you'd stay when you thought I had nothing. Before she could answer, riders appeared on the ridgemen who wanted him ruined, and her gone.
Nếu bạn cũng nghẹt thở như tôi, hãy nhận đăng ký và theo tôi đến hết câu chuyện này.
Đừng quên bình luận thành phố Ban đang xem để tôi biết câu chuyện đã đi xa đến đâu. The bank door slammed so hard the glass rattled in its frame, and every head in Red Hollow's main street turned to watch Caleb Whitmore walk out into the sun with his jaw tight and his hat pulled low. Denied again, muttered Old Man Griggs from the porch of the Mercantile loud enough for Caleb to hear. Third time this year. Caleb didn't answer. He never answered. He kept walking, boots striking the dry planks of the boardwalk, past the women who drew their skirts aside as if his poverty might rub off on them. Past the ranch hands, who smirked and elbowed each other, past the children who had learned from their parents exactly how much a man was worth in this town, and exactly how little Caleb Whitmore was worth. You'd think a man his age would have given up by now, said one of the women, not bothering to lower her voice. Some men just aren't built for anything more than what they've got, said her companion. Caleb's horse, a lean bay gelding with a suede back and dull coat, waited at the hitching post. He untied the reins with steady hands, swung up into the saddle, and turned the animal toward the road out of town without looking back. Only when he'd cleared the last building did his shoulders drop half an inch. Only when the town was a smear of gray behind him did he let his breath out slow, like a man setting down something heavy. He rode for an hour before the land began to change beneath him, before the scrub grass gave way to real grass, and the flat dust gave way to real soil, and the world around him quietly, secretly became something the people of Red Hollow could not have imagined, even if he'd stood in the town square and described it word for word. But he never would. That was the promise he'd made to himself the day his father was buried, and Caleb Whitmore did not break promises. 300 miles east, in a boarding house that smelled of lye soap and old coffee, Clara Bennett sat at a narrow desk with a letter in her hands that she had read so many times. The creases were beginning to tear. Marriage requested. Rancher. Reliable income. Seeking wife of good character, willing to relocate to Wyoming Territory. That was all it said. No name that meant anything to her. No promises beyond survival. But survival was the only promise Clara needed anymore. You don't have to do this, said Mrs. Pruitt, the landlady standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. There are other ways for a young woman to make her way. Not honest ones, Clara said, folding the letter along its worn creases. Not for someone like me. You could stay, find work in town. Doing what? Clara looked up, and there was no self-pity in her eyes, only exhaustion. I've asked at every shop on this street. Every one of them looked at me like I was already a burden before I opened my mouth. Her father's debts had followed her like a shadow ever since his death. Debts she hadn't known existed until men in dark coats began showing up at the door, debts that had swallowed the house. The furniture, even her mother's wedding ring, sold to satisfy men who never once looked her in the eye. Wyoming Territory, Mrs. Pruitt said slowly. That's a hard, empty place, Clara. Emptier than this room. Clara stood, tucking the letter into her bag. At least out there no one will look at me like I owe them something. She didn't know yet that a man 300 miles away was about to become the very thing she swore she'd never trust again, a secret wrapped inside a stranger. The stagecoach ride took 6 days. 6 days of dust, of cramped benches, of an old preacher who read scripture aloud, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. And one particular moment on the 4th day that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. First time out west, asked the woman beside her, a rancher's wife named Sarah, returning from visiting family. First time anywhere, Clara admitted. Mail order. Clara nodded, feeling her face heat. Nothing to be ashamed of, Sarah said, patting her knee. Half the women out here came the same way. Question isn't how you got here. Question's who's waiting when you arrive. I don't know much about him, Clara said. Just that he's a rancher. Name's Whitmore. Sarah went quiet for a moment, her brow creasing like she was trying to place the name. Whitmore, she repeated. Can't say I know him. But Red Hollow's a small town. You'll know everything about everyone inside a week, whether you want to or not. Clara looked out the window at the endless brown land rolling past, and for the first time since she'd mailed her reply to that advertisement, a small, sharp fear moved through her chest. What if he was cruel? What if he was old or ill-tempered or worse? What if the letter had lied the way everything else in her life lately had lied? She pressed her hand flat against her bag, feeling the shape of the letter inside it, and told herself the same thing she'd told herself every night since her father died. You've survived worse. You'll survive this too. She had no way of knowing that the man waiting for her in Red Hollow had spent that very week being humiliated in a bank lobby, being laughed at on a boardwalk, being treated like the poorest, least significant person in the entire territory, and that none of it was true. Red Hollow announced itself with a scattering of buildings that rose out of the dust like an afterthought. A church, a mercantile, a saloon with a crooked sign, a scattering of houses. Clara stepped down from the stagecoach with her legs unsteady beneath her, her one traveling case gripped in both hands, and searched the small crowd for a face that might belong to a man named Caleb Whitmore. She found him standing apart from the others near the edge of the boardwalk, hat in his hands instead of on his head, a gesture of respect. She would realize later, though, at the time, she only noticed how tired he looked, how his coat had been mended more than once, how his boots had clearly walked more miles than they had years left in them. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Yes." She swallowed. "Mr. Whitmore." "Caleb," he said. Just Caleb. There was a silence between them that stretched a beat too long. The kind of silence that comes when two strangers realize they are about to build a life together with nothing but a letter and a leap of faith between them. "I have to be honest with you," Caleb said finally, his voice low, careful. "What I offer isn't much. A small house, simple work. I can't promise comfort. Can't promise." Clara lifted her chin, some old pride rising in her despite everything. "I didn't come here for comfort, Mr. Whitmore. I came here to survive." Something shifted behind his eyes, surprise maybe, or relief, or something else she couldn't name yet. "Then we understand each other," he said. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that understanding was not the same as trust, and trust was not the same as truth. And there was a great deal of truth that Caleb Whitmore had no intention of sharing anytime soon. The wedding took place 2 days later in the small church at the edge of town, with a handful of townspeople watching from the pews with expressions that ranged from pity to open amusement. "Poor girl," someone whispered. "She doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." "She'll figure it out soon enough," someone else murmured back. "One look at that cabin of his." Clara heard every word. She had learned over the last 2 days that Red Hollow was a town that whispered the way other towns breathed constantly, without thinking, without shame. But she said her vows clearly, her voice steady, her hand firm in Caleb's, when the preacher instructed them to join hands. And if she felt the eyes of the town on her back like a physical weight, she did not let it show. Caleb's voice when he spoke his vows was quieter than hers, but no less certain. "For richer, for poorer," he said. And something flickered across his face when he said the word richer, something Clara would only understand much later when the truth of who she'd married finally came apart at the seams. The ride to his home took the better part of an hour, and Clara spent every minute of it bracing herself. She had heard the whispers. She knew what kind of house was waiting for her, a small, poor cabin, the kind of place a struggling ranch hand might call home. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had survived worse than poverty. But when the wagon finally crested a low rise and the house came into view, Clara felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. It was small. It was simple. A modest cabin with a covered porch, a small barn, a corral holding a handful of horses that looked, Clara noted with faint surprise, remarkably well fed for a poor man's stock. "It's not much," Caleb said, watching her face carefully. "But it's solid. Keeps the winter out." "It's fine," Clara said, and meant it. After everything she'd lost, a solid roof felt like a fortune all its own. She didn't yet know how literal that thought would someday become. The first weeks passed in a rhythm Clara hadn't expected. She had braced herself for cruelty, for indifference, for a husband who saw her as nothing more than free labor bought and paid for through the mail. Instead, she found a man who rose before dawn without complaint, who worked from sunup to sundown without a single word of self-pity, who treated the ranch hands who came by with a respect that seemed almost out of place for a man everyone in town called poor. "Morning, Tom," Caleb said one day to a hand delivering supplies. "How's your boy's leg healing?" "Better, Mr. Whitmore. Doc says he'll walk fine come spring." "Good. Tell him I said to rest it proper. No rushing back to chores before he's ready." When Tom had gone, Clara watched Caleb's face curious. "You know his son's leg is broken." "I know most things about the men who work this land," Caleb said simply, and went back to his work before she could ask what he meant by this land, when the land in question appeared to be nothing more than a modest ranch with a handful of acres to its name. It was the little details that began to gather in Clara's mind like pebbles in a jar. Small at first, easy to dismiss, but slowly accumulating into something she couldn't ignore. The supplies that arrived at their door were never cheap goods. The flour was fine milled. The coffee was a quality she hadn't tasted since before her father's death. The tools in the barn were well made, well oiled, clearly expensive despite Caleb's insistence that money was tight. "How do we afford all this?" she asked one evening, setting a fresh loaf of bread on the table. Bread made from flour finer than anything a poor rancher should have been able to purchase. "I make do," Caleb said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Making do doesn't usually look like this." He was quiet for a moment too long. "Some things are better understood with time, Clara." It was the first time he'd used that phrase, a phrase she would come to hear many times over the following weeks, always delivered in that same careful, deflecting tone, always leaving her with more questions than answers. She let it go that first time. But the pebbles kept gathering. The second month brought a night Clara would never forget. A storm rolled through Red Hollow with a violence that rattled the windows and sent the horses screaming in the corral and in the chaos. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Eli, barely 18, was thrown from his horse and dragged several yards before the animal finally broke free. Clara heard the shouting before she understood what was happening. By the time she reached the barn, Caleb was already kneeling beside Eli's still form, his hands moving with a speed and precision that startled her. "Get the doctor," Caleb said, not looking up. "Tell him it's urgent. Tell him I'll cover whatever it costs." "Caleb, we don't have." "Tell him I'll cover it," Caleb repeated sharper this time, and something in his voice made Clara stop arguing. The doctor arrived within the hour, faster than Clara would have expected for a family with no money, and worked through the night to set Eli's broken arm and stitch a gash along his scalp. When the doctor finally packed up his tools near dawn, exhausted, Clara overheard a conversation through the thin cabin walls that she was never meant to hear. "That's a fine bit of doctoring, Mr. Whitmore. Costly given the hour. Send the bill to me directly," Caleb said. "Not to Eli's family. They've got enough to worry about." "You sure this isn't cheap even for—" "I'm sure." Clara lay awake long after the doctor had gone, staring at the ceiling, turning the conversation over in her mind like a stone she couldn't quite identify. "Send the bill to me directly. Not cheap even for—" Even for what? Even for a poor cowboy who could barely keep flour in the pantry. She confronted him the next morning, unable to hold the question in any longer. "How did you pay for that, Caleb, the doctor? All of it. You said yourself money's tight." Caleb was quiet, his hands stilled over the harness he'd been repairing. For a long moment, Clara thought he might finally tell her the truth, whatever truth was hiding behind his careful silences. "I have savings," he said instead. "Set aside for emergencies." Eli's arm was an emergency. Savings that cover a doctor's full night of work without hesitation. "That's not savings, Caleb. That's enough for now," he said, and the finality in his voice closed the conversation like a door swinging shut. Clara turned away, frustration burning hot in her chest, but beneath the frustration was something else, something that frightened her more than his secrecy ever could. She was starting to care about this man, starting to admire the quiet way he moved through the world, the patience he showed his animals, the respect he gave men who had nothing to offer him in return. And the more she cared, the more his secrets felt less like a mystery and more like a wound she didn't understand yet. Word of Eli's recovery spread through Red Hollow within days, and with it came a strange undercurrent of gossip that reached Clara's ears at the Mercantile one afternoon. Whitmore paid for the whole thing himself. One woman was saying to another, unaware Clara stood just around the shelf. "Dr. Medicine, all of it." "That's so man barely scrapes by." That's what I thought too. But my husband said Whitmore's paid for more than a few things around town over the years. Quiet about it, mind you. Never wants credit. Strange for a man with nothing. Strange indeed. Clara stood frozen behind the shelf, a bag of flour clutched to her chest, her mind racing. More than a few things over the years. How many years? How much money? And where, in God's name, was a man everyone called poor, finding it? She left the Mercantile without buying anything. Her thoughts a tangled knot she couldn't begin to unravel. That night she tried again, softer this time, hoping gentleness might loosen what stubbornness had not. "Caleb," she said, as they sat together after supper, the fire casting long shadows across the small room. "I'm not trying to pry into things that aren't mine to know. But I'm your wife now. If there's something I should understand about you, about us, I'd rather hear it from you than piece it together from whispers in town." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara thought she'd pushed too far. "There are things about my life," he said slowly, "that I haven't told anyone in this town. Not because I don't trust you, Clara, because I need to know something first." "Know what?" He looked at her, then really looked at her in a way that made her breath catch. "I need to know if the person sitting across from me chose this life, chose me, because she wanted to, or because she thought she had no other choice." "That's not fair," Clara said quietly. "You're asking me to prove something to you while you hide everything from me." "I know," Caleb said. "I know it isn't fair, but I've spent my whole life watching people change the moment they learn what a man is worth. I needed time before that happened to us, if it's going to happen at all." Clara sat with that for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, and though she didn't understand what he meant, not fully, not yet, something in his voice told her this wasn't cruelty. It was fear. A fear so old and so deep that it had reshaped the entire structure of his life. "All right," she said finally. "I won't push. But don't mistake my patience for blindness, Caleb. I see more than you think I do." "I'm starting to understand that," he said, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Red Hollow, he almost smiled. The weeks that followed brought a strange, fragile peace between them, not quite trust, not quite understanding, but something adjacent to both. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch, the names of the animals, the small routines that filled Caleb's days. She learned that he read more than any poor rancher had any business reading, his small shelf of books far too extensive and far too fine-bound for a man scraping by. She learned that he wrote letters late at night, sealing them carefully, sending them off with a writer who came by every few weeks, a writer who never lingered in town, never spoke to anyone, and always left before Clara could ask him a single question. "Who is that man?" she asked once, watching the writer disappear down the road. "Someone who helps me manage things," Caleb said, which told her nothing at all. She began to suspect, though she couldn't have said exactly why, that the writer wasn't carrying letters about ranch supplies or feed prices. There was something in the careful way Caleb sealed each envelope, something in the low, private conversations he sometimes had with the man on the porch, voices too quiet for her to catch more than fragments. The accounts are settled through the quarter. Tell them I'll review the reports myself when... Accounts, reports. Words that belong to a man of business, not a man who could barely afford flour. The mini-mysteries kept stacking one after another, until Clara felt like she was living inside a house with 100 locked doors and no keys. There was the matter of the book's leather-bound volumes on law, on land management, on finance tucked away on a shelf Caleb clearly didn't think she paid attention to. There was the matter of his hands calloused, yes, roughened by real work, but too well kept for a man who supposedly owned nothing beyond the labor of his own back. There was the matter of the men who occasionally rode out to see him, men in fine coats. Men who spoke to Caleb with a deference that made no sense for a poor rancher. Men who called him sir, in low voices, before catching themselves and correcting to something more casual once they realized Clara was within earshot. Just business associates, Caleb would say every time in the same tired, deflecting tone. Some things are better understood with time. I have savings. Just business associates. Clara began keeping a mental list of every excuse, every careful evasion, every unanswered question, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a growing certainty that the man she'd married was not at all the man Red Hollow believed him to be. The first real crack in the wall came on an ordinary afternoon when Clara found herself alone in the cabin, while Caleb rode out to check on a distant fence line. She wasn't looking for anything. She told herself that later over and over, as if repetition could make it true. She had simply been cleaning, dusting the small shelf of books, when a folded paper slipped from between two volumes and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up without thinking, and her breath caught the moment her eyes landed on the letterhead. Whitmore Land and Cattle Holdings Quarterly Report. Numbers followed figures so large that Clara had to read them 3 times before her mind would accept what she was seeing. Acreage, livestock counts, revenue figures that made her father's old debts look like pocket change. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper back along its original creases and slid it back into place, her heart hammering so loud she could hear it in her ears. Whitmore Land and Cattle Holdings. Not a poor rancher's modest spread. Something vast. Something that had been hidden from her from everyone behind a mask of poverty, so convincing that an entire town had been fooled for years. She stood frozen in the center of the small cabin, staring at the shelf, feeling the entire foundation of her marriage shift beneath her feet. Who was she actually married to, Moda? Clara said nothing that evening. She couldn't. Every time she opened her mouth to ask, the words caught somewhere behind her teeth, tangled up with fear and confusion, and something that felt uncomfortably close to betrayal. She watched Caleb across the supper table, studying his face, as if she might find the truth written somewhere in the lines of it. He seemed the same as always, quiet, steady, careful with his words. But now she saw the careful quietness for what it might actually be. Not humility, not simplicity. A mask. "You're staring," Caleb said, not unkindly, glancing up from his plate. "Am I?" Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Just thinking. About the fact that I might be married to a man worth more than every family in this town combined." "Nothing important," she said instead, and hated the lie the moment it left her mouth, because it was the first real lie she had told him since arriving in Red Hollow. That night, long after Caleb had fallen asleep, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her mind turning over every strange detail of the last 2 months, like pieces of a puzzle, finally beginning to form a picture. The fine supplies, the expensive books. The doctor paid without hesitation. The men in fine coats who called him sir. The writer who came and went with sealed letters. The phrase, "some things are better understood with time," repeated so many times it had become almost a wall between them. And now, a report bearing a name she'd never heard before. Whitmore Land and Cattle Holdings. She thought of the whispers in town. Poorest cowboy in the territory. Nothing to his name. She thought of the pity in people's eyes when they looked at her, the mail-order bride who'd married a man with nothing. None of it made sense unless the poverty itself was the lie, a performance so complete that even the man's own neighbors had been fooled by it. But why? Why would a man hide something so vast, so significant behind rags and worn boots, and a life of quiet suffering? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she knew lying there in the dark beside a husband, she was no longer certain she understood that the truth was coming for both of them, whether Caleb was ready to share it or not. The next morning brought a visitor. Clara hadn't expected a well-dressed man in a fine gray coat, his boots polished to a shine that looked entirely out of place against the dusty ranch yard. "Is Mr. Whitmore in?" the man asked, removing his hat with a formality that made Clara's pulse quicken. "He's out checking the fence line," Clara said carefully. "May I ask who's calling?" "Marcus Feld," the man said. "I handle certain business matters for Mr. Whitmore. It's rather urgent." "Business matters," Clara repeated slowly. What kind of business would a rancher need handled so urgently? Something flickered across Marcus Feld's face. A flash of surprise quickly smoothed over. "I'm sure Mr. Whitmore will explain when he's able, ma'am. If you'd simply let him know I called, I'd be grateful." He left without another word, riding off toward the mountains, in a direction Clara had never seen anyone travel before, not toward town, not toward any ranch she knew of, but deeper into the wilderness, toward a place that, as far as she knew, held nothing but rock and pine. She stood in the yard long after he'd disappeared, one question burning brighter than all the others. Where exactly does that road lead? Check. When Caleb returned that evening, Clara was waiting for him on the porch arms, crossed her patience finally completely exhausted. "A man came by today," she said before he'd even dismounted. "Marcus Feld. Said he handles business matters for you. Urgent business matters." Caleb's expression shifted, not panic exactly, but something close to resignation, like a man who had been expecting this moment and had simply run out of ways to delay it. "I see," he said quietly. "Do you—" Clara's voice cracked, months of confusion finally breaking loose. "Because I don't, Caleb. I found a report, quarterly figures, a company name I've never heard, Whitmore Land and Cattle Holdings, numbers I can't even make sense of. And now a man in a fine coat is asking after you like you're some kind of—" "Clara. Don't," she said, her voice shaking now. "Don't tell me it's better understood with time. I've heard that phrase until it makes me sick. I want the truth. Right now." Caleb stood very still, the reins of his horse still gripped in one hand, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity she'd never seen from him before. "You're right," he said finally. "It's time." "Time for what?" "To show you something I haven't shown anyone in a very long time." He asked her to ride with him the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, and Clara agreed with her heart hammering so hard she could scarcely breathe. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour, following a trail Clara had never traveled before, one that wound deeper and deeper into the mountains, past landmarks she didn't recognize, past a fork in the road that Marcus Feld had taken the day before. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Somewhere I should have shown you the day we married," Caleb said. "Somewhere I've been afraid to show anyone since my father died." "Afraid of what?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rawness to it that Clara had never heard before. "Afraid of what happens to a person," he said, "when someone loves them for what they own instead of who they are." The trail curved upward, cutting through a dense stand of pine, and just as Clara opened her mouth to ask another question, the trees fell away entirely, and the world in front of her stole every word she'd been about to say. Below them stretched a valley unlike anything Clara had ever seen. Carefully tended roads wound between vast pastures dotted with cattle beyond counting. Barns larger than the entire cabin she'd been living in stood in neat rows. Workers moved between buildings with the organized purpose of a small town all their own. And at the center of it all, rising from the valley floor, like something out of a dream, stood a mansion built of pale stone and dark timber, its windows catching the morning light, its balconies wrapped in carved wood, its grounds stretching out in every direction farther than Clara's eye could follow. She sat frozen on her horse, unable to speak, unable to move, staring at a home so vast it seemed to belong to some other world entirely. Not the world of a poor cowboy who'd been denied credit at the bank just weeks earlier. Not the world of whispered pity and worn boots and borrowed dignity. "Caleb," she finally managed. "What is this place?" He looked at her for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried the weight of every secret he'd been carrying since the day his father was buried. "This is my home," he said quietly. "This has always been my home. And everything you thought you knew about me, the poverty, the struggle, the man everyone in Red Hollow pities, none of it was true." Clara's chest tightened, her mind racing to catch up with what her eyes were telling her. "Then who are you?" she whispered. "Who did I actually marry?" Caleb's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, real fear moved across his face. Not fear of the mansion, not fear of the wealth stretching out below them, but fear of her answer to the truth he was finally about to give her. "My name is Caleb Whitmore," he said slowly, "heir to one of the largest cattle and land empires in this territory. And everything I let you believe about who I was, I did it because I needed to know before I told you the truth, whether you could ever love a man like me, for reasons that had nothing to do with what I owned." The valley stretched silent around them, the mansion gleaming in the morning light, and Clara sat on her horse feeling the entire foundation of her marriage crack wide open beneath her. Not because her husband was wealthy, but because for 2 months the man she had begun to trust, begun to care for, begun to build a life beside, had been lying to her about the single most important truth of his entire existence. "You let me believe we might starve," she said, her voice shaking with something between fury and heartbreak. "You let me marry a man I thought had nothing, when all along—" "Clara, how could you do that to me?" she demanded, tears burning hot and sudden in her eyes. "How could you let me care about you without knowing which version of you I was actually caring about?" Caleb opened his mouth to answer, but before a single word could leave him, the sound of hoofbeats rose from the trail behind them. Riders approaching fast riders? Clara didn't recognize riders whose grim, purposeful expressions told her immediately that whatever truth Caleb had just revealed was about to become the least of their problems. "Caleb," one of the men called out, reining his horse to a hard stop. "We need to talk. Now. It's about the Ashford contracts, and it's about her." He nodded toward Clara, and the look in his eyes was not curiosity. It was suspicion, cold sharp, and already certain of an answer neither Clara nor Caleb had spoken aloud yet. The rider who had spoken didn't wait for an invitation. He swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, boots hitting the ground hard, his eyes moving from Caleb to Clara and back again with the sharp calculation of a man already building a case in his head. "Marcus told us you'd finally brought her up here," the man said. "Didn't believe him. Man like you hiding a marriage this long? Didn't seem like you." "This isn't the time." "Reeves," Caleb said, his voice low-controlled in a way that Clara hadn't heard from him before. Not the quiet patience of the rancher she'd married, but something harder, something that belonged to a different version of him entirely. "It's exactly the time," Reeves said. "Ashford's lawyers filed papers yesterday, challenging the succession. Says the estate can't pass clean if there's a wife nobody vetted, nobody approved, showed up out of nowhere 3 months before your father's anniversary clause comes due." Clara felt the words land somewhere she couldn't process yet. Succession. Anniversary clause. Ashford's lawyers. None of it made sense, and all of it made her stomach twist with a dread she couldn't name. "What is he talking about?" she asked, turning to Caleb. "What anniversary clause?" Caleb's jaw worked, and for the first time since she'd known him, she watched him struggle to find words at all. "My father's will," he said finally. "There's a provision. If I'm not married by the 2nd anniversary of his death, the estate transfers to a board of trustees. Men my father trusted. Men who've been circling this land for 2 years, waiting for exactly that to happen. And now you have a wife." Reeves said, his tone flat, almost accusing. "Convenient timing." "Watch yourself," Caleb said, and something in his voice made even Reeves take half a step back. Clara's mind was racing now, pieces slamming together too fast to catch. "You married me because of a clause in your father's will." "No," Caleb said immediately, turning to face her fully. Clara, no. I married you because the timing worked, she said, and her voice had gone cold flat, the way it did when she was holding back something enormous. Because you needed a wife before some deadline and I showed up at exactly the right moment. That is not what happened. How would I know that? Her voice cracked. 2 months ago you didn't exist to me. Now I find out you're the heir to an empire, that you married me under a legal deadline I never knew existed, and that men are already showing up to say I'm not real. That none of this is real. Clara. Don't, she said, holding up a hand, though her eyes had filled despite herself. Just don't. Reeves watched the exchange with something close to satisfaction, and it was that look more than anything that made Clara square her shoulders and turn back to him with a fire she didn't know she still had in her. You said Ashford's lawyers filed papers, she said. On what grounds? Reeves blinked clearly, not expecting her to speak to him directly. Grounds that the marriage was arranged for financial convenience, rather than genuine. I didn't know he had $1 to his name until an hour ago, Clara said. I married a man I believed was poorer than I was. If anyone in this valley arranged anything for financial convenience, it certainly wasn't me. That landed harder than she expected. Reeves's mouth opened, then closed again, and for a moment even Caleb looked at her with something like astonishment. That's not going to hold up against Ashford's lawyers, Reeves said finally, though the certainty in his voice had thinned considerably. Then Ashford's lawyers can meet me in whatever courtroom they'd like, Clara said. Because I have nothing to hide. Can the same be said for the men circling this land like vultures for 2 years? Reeves left within the hour, riding hard back down the mountain, and the moment he was gone, the fragile bravery Clara had been holding together collapsed all at once. She sat down hard on a low stone wall at the edge of the mansion's drive, her hands shaking, the full weight of everything she'd learned in the last 2 hours finally crashing down on her. Clara. Caleb crouched in front of her, his voice gentler now. Look at me. I don't even know who you are, she said. I don't know what to look at. Yes, you do, he said. I'm the same man who woke up beside you every morning for 2 months. The same man who paid Eli's doctor bill without a second thought. The same man who never once raised his voice at you, never once treated you like less than you are. None of that changed in the last hour, Clara. Only the roof over my head changed. That's not just a roof, she said, gesturing at the mansion behind him, her voice rising. That's an empire. That's lawyers and trustees and anniversary clauses and men riding up mountains to accuse me of things I didn't even know were possible to be accused of. You didn't just hide a house from me, Caleb. You hid an entire life. I know. Then explain it, she said. All of it. No more. Some things are better understood with time. I want the truth right now, everything, or I swear to God, I will walk back down that mountain myself. Caleb sat down beside her on the stone wall, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, gathering himself the way a man gathers courage before stepping into deep water. My father built this place from nothing, he said finally. Started with 40 acres and a herd of 12 cattle. By the time he died, it was 30,000 acres and more cattle than anyone in the territory could count. He was proud of it. Prouder of the men he built it with than the money it made him. Then why hide it? Because 6 months before he died, my father told me something I never forgot, Caleb said. He told me that every woman who'd ever shown interest in our family after the money came in looked at him different than the ones who'd known him before it. Softer, more eager. He said he could feel the exact moment people stopped seeing him and started seeing what he had. Clara said nothing, but something in her chest loosened slightly, listening. When he died, Caleb went on, I inherited everything. The land, the cattle, this house, and within a month, I had women writing me letters I'd never asked for, business partners inviting me to dinners. I'd never wanted men calling themselves friends who'd never spoken 2 words to me while my father was alive. I hated every second of it. So you disappeared. I told the men who managed the estate, Marcus, a handful of others, that I needed distance. I moved down to a small cabin outside Red Hollow, took work as a hand on other men's ranches, let people believe exactly what they wanted to believe. and for the first time since my father died, people started treating me like a person instead of a fortune. "But you kept all this?" Clara said, gesturing again at the valley. "You never gave it up." "No," Caleb admitted. "I couldn't. My father built it for the men who work it, for the families who depend on it. Walking away from that would have been its own kind of betrayal. So I split myself in two. Caleb the rancher, poor and unremarkable, living small and quiet, and Caleb Whitmore, the man behind all this, existing only on paper, managed from a distance. And then the anniversary clause." Caleb's expression tightened. "My father's final condition. If I wasn't married within 2 years of his death, the estate transfers to a board of trustees, men he trusted once, but who I've watched grow greedier every year since he died. I had less than 3 months left when I placed that advertisement." There it was, the thing Clara had been dreading since Reeves said the word convenient. "So I was a solution," she said quietly. "Not a choice. A deadline you needed to meet." "You were both," Caleb said, and there was something raw and unguarded in his voice, now stripped of all his usual careful control. "I needed a wife before the clause came due, yes. But Clara, I could have married any woman who answered that advertisement. I chose to keep living small around you. I chose not to tell you who I really was, not because the clause demanded it, but because I needed to know something for myself." "Know what?" "Whether a woman could still choose me," he said, "if she thought there was nothing to gain from it." Clara looked at him for a long moment, the anger in her chest tangled up now with something softer, something she didn't want to feel, yet not with so much unresolved between them. "And did I?" she asked quietly. "Choose you? I don't know," Caleb admitted. "That's what scares me more than Ashford, more than Reeves, more than any lawyer in this territory. I don't know if what we built these last 2 months was real, or if it was just two frightened people surviving side by side because neither of us had anywhere else to go." They didn't return to the small cabin that night. Instead, Caleb led her into the mansion itself, through halls that smelled of polished wood and old stone, past rooms that Clara could scarcely take in a library twice the size of the entire cabin, a dining hall that could have sat 40 guests, windows that stretched from floor to ceiling and framed the valley like a painting. She said nothing as they walked. She couldn't. Every step deeper into the house felt like stepping deeper into a life she had no idea how to inhabit. "You grew up here?" she finally asked, standing in the doorway of a room lined floor to ceiling with books. "Some of it," Caleb said. "The rest I learned to run after my father died. Ledgers, contracts, land disputes. Things no one teaches a boy who spends his childhood on horseback. You could have told me," Clara said, "even a little at a time. You could have trusted me with pieces of this." "I know," Caleb said. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of me. Of losing the only thing that ever felt real," he said. "The way you looked at me before you knew any of this. I was afraid that once you saw all this, you'd start looking at me the way everyone else does." Clara crossed the room and stood in front of him close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. "I'm still deciding how angry I am with you, Caleb Whitmore. But I want you to hear this clearly. I did not marry a mansion. I did not fall into whatever this is becoming because of stone walls and fine books. If I choose to stay in this now, and I haven't decided that I will, it will be because of the man who paid a doctor's bill in the middle of a storm without a second thought. Not because of any of this." Something in Caleb's face cracked open, relief and disbelief tangled together. "You're saying there's a chance you'll stay?" "I'm saying I haven't left yet," Clara said. "That's all I can promise tonight." The following morning brought no peace. Marcus Feld arrived before breakfast, his expression grim, a leather folder tucked under one arm. "The Ashford filing is worse than Reeves let on," Marcus said without preamble, setting the folder on the long dining table. "They're not just challenging the timing of the marriage, they're challenging its legitimacy entirely." "On what grounds?" Caleb asked, already opening the folder. "They've hired an investigator, digging into Mrs. Whitmore's background in the East." Marcus glanced at Clara, apologetic. "Her father's debts." The circumstances of her departure. They're building an argument that she came west specifically seeking a wealthy match using the mail order system as cover. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. That's not true. I answered a letter that said rancher. I had no idea. I believe you, Marcus said quickly. But belief isn't evidence, and Ashford's lawyers only need to plant enough doubt to convince a judge the marriage was fraudulent from the start. If they succeed, the anniversary clause is voided. The estate transfers to the board, and Ashford has 3 men on that board already in his pocket. Caleb's hands had gone very still over the papers. How much time do we have? The hearing's been set for 3 weeks from now, Marcus said. In Cheyenne, 3 weeks. Clara felt the number settle into her chest like a stone. 3 weeks to prove that whatever existed between her and Caleb wasn't some elaborate deception when even she wasn't entirely certain what it was yet. There's something else, Marcus added, and his tone shifted, careful now, in a way that made Clara's stomach tighten further. The investigator Ashford hired. He's already been to Red Hollow, talked to half the town, and from what I understand, he's found something about Mrs. Whitmore's father that concerns me. What kind of something? Clara asked, her voice tight. Marcus hesitated. Your father's debts, Mrs. Whitmore. The investigator claims they weren't simple mismanagement. He's suggesting they were the result of a deliberate fraud one your father was involved in himself. Clara stood so fast, her chair scraped hard against the floor. That's a lie. I'm only telling you what he's claiming, Marcus said gently. But if it reaches the hearing, it won't matter whether it's true. It'll be another thread for Ashford to pull. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth. Memories she'd buried for months rising up unbidden, the men in dark coats. The papers, she'd never fully understood the sudden collapse of everything her family had once owned. My father was many things, she said finally, her voice shaking. But he was not a fraud. He was foolish. He trusted the wrong men with our money. That is not the same as committing a crime. Then we need proof of that, Caleb said quietly, watching her. Because if Ashford's investigator finds the wrong document or bribes the wrong clerk, he won't need the truth. He'll only need something that looks close enough to it. The next several days blurred together in a haze of urgency. Marcus rode back and forth between the mansion and Cheyenne, gathering documents, meeting with lawyers, building whatever defense could be assembled in so little time. Caleb spent long hours locked in the study papers, spread across every surface, his face growing more drawn with each passing day. Clara found herself unexpectedly drawn into the work alongside him. You don't have to do this, Caleb said one night, finding her at the study desk with a stack of ledgers in front of her. Yes, I do, Clara said, not looking up. If Ashford wants to prove I married you for money, the last thing I'm going to do is sit quietly in a corner while other people fight for me. I managed my father's accounts for 2 years before everything fell apart. I know how to read a ledger. Let me help. Caleb studied her for a long moment. What are you looking for? Anything that shows a pattern, Clara said. If my father's debts were fraud, someone benefited from it. Fraud doesn't happen in a vacuum, Caleb. Someone profited while my family lost everything. If I can find who that was, maybe I can prove my father was a victim instead of a criminal. You think you can find that in old debt records? I think, Clara said, that whoever taught me to read a ledger this carefully taught me because he suspected something was wrong long before he ever told me. I just never had the pieces to see it until now. She spent the following nights buried in correspondence Marcus had gathered from banks and lawyers back east, cross-referencing names, dates, signatures, looking for the pattern she was certain existed somewhere in the wreckage of her father's ruin. And on the 4th night, she found it. Caleb. Her voice cut through the quiet study sharp with discovery. Look at this. He crossed the room quickly, leaning over her shoulder as she spread 3 documents side by side. These are loan agreements my father signed, she said. 3 of them over 2 years, all with the same lender. Look at the signatures on the guarantor line. Caleb studied the pages, and his eyes narrowed. These aren't the same hand. No, Clara said. They're forged. My father's signature is different on every single one. Someone was taking out loans in his name, using his credit, and my father never signed a single one of these documents himself. Who's the lender? Clara turned to the letterhead at the top of each document, and when she read the name aloud, the study went utterly silent. Ashford Trust and Lending. Caleb straightened slowly, his face going pale, then hard, then something colder than Clara had ever seen from him. Ashford, he repeated. The same man challenging our marriage. The same man, Clara said, who apparently built part of his fortune defrauding my father, then hired an investigator to accuse my father of the exact crime he committed himself. They rode to Marcus's office in Cheyenne the following morning, the documents secured carefully in Clara's bag, both of them silent for most of the journey, the weight of what they'd found sitting heavy between them. If this is real, Marcus said, spreading the forged signatures across his desk once they arrived. This isn't just a defense against Ashford's claims. This is an offense. If we can prove Ashford orchestrated fraud against Mrs. Whitmore's family, it undermines everything he's brought against you both. No judge will side with a man exposed as a fraudster himself. Can you prove it in 3 weeks? Caleb asked. I can try, Marcus said. But I'll need more than these 3 documents. I'll need testimony, bank records, someone willing to speak against Ashford directly, and men like that don't come cheap or easy to find. Then we find them, Clara said, her voice steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. I didn't survive my father's ruin, just to let the man who caused it destroy what little I have left. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, something like respect crossing his face. You're not what I expected, Mrs. Whitmore. Ashford's investigator painted you as a woman looking for an easy fortune. I don't think easy is a word that's ever applied to you. No, Clara said. It never has. That night back at the mansion, Clara found Caleb standing alone on the balcony overlooking the valley, the same balcony she would realize much later, where so much of their story would eventually come to rest. You didn't have to do any of that today, he said, not turning as she approached. The ledgers, the documents. You could have let Marcus handle it and stayed out of the fight entirely. I told you already, Clara said, coming to stand beside him. I don't sit quietly while other people decide my fate. No, Caleb said, finally turning to look at her. You don't. I'm starting to understand that about you more every day. They stood in silence for a moment, the valley stretching dark and vast below them, and Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day become it. I still don't know if I can trust you completely, she said quietly. 2 months of secrets doesn't disappear because we found one piece of evidence together. I know, Caleb said, but I meant what I said in the library. I'm not fighting for this. She gestured vaguely toward the mansion behind them. I'm fighting because Ashford hurt my family once already, and I refuse to let him do it again to either of us. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. For what it's worth, Clara, I've never once in all my life wanted someone to fight beside me the way you fought today. Not because I needed the help, because I wanted it to be you. Clara didn't answer right away. She only looked out at the valley, at the dark shapes of cattle grazing in distant pastures, at the life she had never asked for, and now found herself unwilling to simply walk away from. 3 weeks, she said finally. Let's survive 3 weeks first. Then we can talk about trust. No. The days that followed moved with a relentless, grinding urgency. Marcus returned twice more with new documents, new names, new threads to pull at a former clerk at Ashford Trust, who'd left the company under mysterious circumstances 2 years prior, a banker in Cheyenne who might remember irregularities in the original loan filings, a pattern of forged signatures that seemed to stretch back even further than Clara's father's ruin. There are others, Marcus said grimly, laying out a list of names during one of his visits. At least 4 other families Ashford appears to have defrauded the same way. Loans taken in their name debts, manufactured land seized when the family couldn't pay what they never actually borrowed. 4 families, Clara repeated, horror creeping into her voice. How has no one stopped him? Because he's careful, Marcus said. And because most of those families didn't have anyone with your eye for numbers, Mrs. Whitmore, or anyone willing to fight this hard to clear their name. Caleb, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, finally spoke. If we can get even one of those families to testify, it changes everything. It's no longer Clara's word against Ashford's accusations. It's a pattern of fraud spanning years. I can try to reach them, Marcus said, but it'll take time we don't have much of. Then I'll go myself, Clara said suddenly, and both men turned to look at her. If it's a woman reaching out to another family that's been wronged the same way my family was wronged, they might listen faster than a lawyer showing up with legal papers. Clara, that's not safe, Caleb said. If Ashford's men are watching us as closely as Reeves suggested, then I'll be careful, Clara said. But I won't sit inside this mansion surrounded by wealth I never asked for while other families suffer the same fate mine did. I know what it feels like to have no one believe you. I won't let that happen to someone else if I can stop it. Caleb studied her for a long moment, something fierce and unguarded moving behind his eyes. Then I'm coming with you. You have an estate to run and a hearing to prepare for. And I have a wife, Caleb said, riding toward a man who's already tried to destroy her family once. I'm not staying behind for ledgers, Clara. They found the first family. 2 days later, the Coopers, a modest household on the outskirts of Cheyenne, who'd lost half their land 3 years prior to a debt the father swore he'd never taken on. We tried telling the courts, Mrs. Cooper said, her voice thin with old exhaustion as she poured coffee with shaking hands. No one believed a farmer's word against a banker's paperwork. We lost the fight before we ever really started it. We have proof now, Clara said gently, sliding the forged signatures across the table. Look at this. Compare it to any document you know your husband actually signed. The hand is different. It was different in my father's case, too. Mrs. Cooper's eyes filled as she studied the papers, recognition and old grief crossing her face at once. That's not his signature, she whispered. That's never been his signature. I told the bank that. I told them and told them. We're building a case against Ashford, Caleb said. If your husband would be willing to testify alongside others. He's wronged. It could be enough to expose the pattern for what it really is. Mrs. Cooper looked between them for a long moment, old fear and new hope warring visibly on her face. He's afraid, she admitted. Afraid of what a man like Ashford could do to us if we fight back and lose. I understand that fear better than you know, Clara said quietly. But I also know what happens when we stay silent. Ashford wins either way. At least if we fight, there's a chance. By the time they left the Cooper farm that evening, Mrs. Cooper had promised to speak with her husband, and something in her eyes suggested she already knew what his answer would be. The second family took more convincing. The third refused outright, too frightened of retaliation to risk everything they had left. But by the end of the week, Clara and Caleb had gathered 3 separate families willing to testify, 3 separate stories of forged signatures and manufactured debts, 3 threads that all led back to the same man. This is more than I expected, Marcus admitted when they returned to Cheyenne, laying out the collected testimonies across his desk. This isn't just enough to defend against Ashford's claims anymore. This could be enough to end him entirely. Then let's end him, Caleb said, and there was a coldness in his voice Clara hadn't heard before, not cruelty, but something close to it, the fury of a man who had just learned the true depth of the damage done to his wife's family. But even as the case began to solidify, even as hope began to feel almost tangible, a new complication arrived that neither of them had anticipated. It came in the form of a letter delivered to the mansion 3 days before the hearing, sealed with wax stamped in a crest Clara didn't recognize. Caleb read it in silence, his face going pale, then rigid, then filled with an anger so sudden and sharp that Clara took an involuntary step back. "What is it?" she asked. "Ashford," Caleb said, his voice tight. "He's not just challenging the marriage anymore. He's threatening to expose something else." "What else is there to expose?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally looked up at her, there was something in his eyes that frightened her more than anything Reeves or Marcus had said in the last 2 weeks. "My mother," he said quietly. Ashford's letter says he has evidence about how she died. Evidence that could implicate my father in ways I never knew, never wanted to know, and never expected to see, used as a weapon in a courtroom. Caleb. He's saying that if we don't withdraw our case against him, drop every testimony we've gathered, he'll bring this into the hearing instead. Turn it into a spectacle about my family, instead of a trial about his fraud. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her again, the same way it had the moment she first saw the mansion, the same way it had every time another layer of Caleb's hidden life peeled back to reveal something new. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "Whatever he's claiming about your mother?" Caleb didn't answer right away, and in his silence Clara understood that the story of Caleb Whitmore, the story she thought she had finally begun to understand, was about to become far more complicated than either of them had ever imagined. "I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was 8 years old when she died. All I was ever told was that it was an accident. But if Ashford has something, a document, a witness, anything, then maybe the truth I grew up believing was never the truth at all." The two of them stood together in the quiet, the weight of Ashford's threat settling over them like a shadow. Neither could yet see the edges of, and somewhere beyond the mansion's walls in a valley Clara had never imagined existing. 3 months ago, the sound of another rider's hoofbeats began rising fast up the long road toward the house, a messenger Marcus would later confirm carrying news that would change the direction of their fight entirely. The messenger didn't slow his horse until he was nearly at the front steps, and by the time Marcus swung down from the saddle, his face was already grim enough that Clara felt her stomach drop before he'd said a single word. "It's worse than the letter," Marcus said, striding past them into the house without waiting for an invitation. "Ashford's not bluffing about the hearing, he's moved it up." "Moved it up how much?" Caleb demanded, following him into the study. 4 days, Marcus said. "He filed an emergency motion this morning claiming new evidence requires immediate judicial attention. The judge granted it within the hour." "That's not possible," Clara said. "Motions like that take weeks to process." "Not when the judge owes Ashford a debt he's spent 3 years pretending doesn't exist," Marcus said grimly. "I should have seen this coming. Ashford's not just fighting to win. He's fighting to make sure we don't have time to build a real defense." Caleb's hands braced against the desk, his knuckles white. 4 days. We have 3 families willing to testify, forged documents, a pattern of fraud stretching back years, and 4 days to organize all of it into something a courtroom will actually accept. "There's more," Marcus said, and something in his voice made Clara's chest tighten further. "Ashford's included your mother in the new filing, not as a footnote, as a central piece of his defense. He's arguing that the Whitmore family history of concealment, his words not mine, extends back 2 generations, and that neither you nor your father can be trusted to present an honest account of anything, including this marriage." Clara watched Caleb's face, carefully waiting for the anger she expected, but instead she saw something worse. She saw fear. Old, buried, unfamiliar fear, the kind that belonged to an 8-year-old boy who'd never been given the full truth about the day his mother died. "I need to know what actually happened to her," Caleb said quietly. "Before Ashford stands up in that courtroom and tells a version of the story I've never even heard myself." They found the answer, or the beginning of it, in a locked drawer of his father's old desk. A desk Caleb had avoided opening for 11 years, ever since his father's funeral, as if the wood itself carried some weight he wasn't ready to hold. "I don't have the key," Caleb admitted, staring at the brass lock like it was something dangerous. "Then we'll make one," Clara said, already moving toward the tool shed behind the mansion, and within the hour, with a borrowed set of picks from one of the ranch hands, and more patience than either of them expected to need, the lock finally gave way. Inside, beneath old ledgers and faded correspondence, they found a single envelope, yellowed with age, addressed simply, "For Caleb when he is ready." Caleb's hands trembled as he broke the seal. The letter inside was written in his father's hand. The ink faded but legible, and as Caleb read it aloud in a voice that grew quieter with every line, Clara felt the entire history of his family reshape itself in real time. "My son," Caleb read. "If you are reading this, then either I have finally found the courage to give it to you myself, or I am gone, and someone else has decided you're old enough for the truth. Your mother did not die by accident, though for years I told everyone, including you, that she did. The truth is harder, and I was a coward for hiding it." Clara reached for his hand without thinking, and he let her take it, his eyes never leaving the page. "Your mother discovered 2 months before she died that a business partner of mine, a man named Charles Ashford, had been defrauding half the ranchers in this territory using forged loan documents. She confronted him directly alone against my wishes. 3 days later, she was thrown from a horse that had never once given us trouble in 8 years of riding." Caleb's voice cracked. Clara tightened her grip on his hand. "I could never prove Ashford was responsible. I searched for 2 years and found nothing solid enough to bring before a judge. But I knew in my heart that my silence about her death, my decision to call it an accident rather than pursue a truth I could not prove, was its own kind of failure. I built walls around this family after that, Caleb. I taught you to distrust the world, to hide our wealth, to fear what people become once they know what we have. I see now that I taught you fear instead of courage. I am sorry. If Ashford ever threatens, you know this, he has been running from this truth far longer than we have. Use that. It is the only weapon I never had the courage to use myself." The letter ended there, and the study fell into a silence so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat. "He knew," Caleb finally said, his voice hollow. "My father knew, or at least suspected, and he never told me. 11 years, and he let me believe it was an accident. He was protecting you," Clara said quietly. "The same way you tried to protect yourself by hiding all of this from me. Fear does strange things to the people who love us, Caleb. It doesn't always look like love, but it usually is." Caleb looked at her, something raw and grateful moving across his face. "You're defending him, after everything you've learned about how this family keeps secrets." "I'm not defending the secrets," Clara said. "I'm recognizing the fear underneath them. I know what that looks like better than most people, Caleb. I've been living inside it since my father died, too." Dean. Marcus. When they showed him the letter the following morning, went very still, reading it twice before setting it down with visible care. "This changes everything," he said. "If we can find any corroborating evidence, a witness, a doctor's report from the accident, anything suggesting the horse was tampered with. This isn't just a defense against Ashford's claims about your family history. This is a direct accusation of murder." 11 years old, Caleb said. "Any witnesses could be dead, any physical evidence long gone." "Not necessarily," Marcus said. "Who examined your mother after the accident?" Caleb's brow furrowed, memory straining backward through more than a decade. "Doc Harmon. He retired years ago, moved to his daughter's place outside Laramie, if he's even still alive." "Then we ride to Laramie," Clara said immediately. "Today. We have 4 days, Caleb. We can't afford to waste a single one of them." The ride to Laramie took the better part of a day, and by the time they arrived at the modest farmhouse where Doc Harmon now lived, Clara's entire body ached with exhaustion and nerves in equal measure. The old doctor, gray-haired and slow-moving but sharp-eyed, listened to Caleb's request with a grave expression that suggested he'd been waiting 11 years for someone to finally ask the question out loud. "I always wondered if someone would come asking," Harmon said, settling into a worn chair on his porch. "Your father asked me not to say anything back then, said it would only cause more pain dragging up questions we couldn't answer." "What questions?" Caleb asked, leaning forward. "The horse," Harmon said. "Gentle animal. Rode that mare myself a dozen times. Never gave anyone trouble in all the years I knew her. But when I examined the animal after your mother's fall, your father asked me to look her over, make sure she hadn't been injured too. I found something strange under the saddle blanket. A small puncture. Fresh. Like something sharp had been pressed against her side just before she threw your mother." Clara felt the air leave her lungs. "You're saying someone deliberately spooked the horse?" "I'm saying I found evidence that suggested it," Harmon said carefully. "I told your father exactly what I found. He asked me never to speak of it publicly, said he needed time to find proof before making any accusations, and that a horse with a puncture mark wasn't proof enough to convict anyone of anything." Did you write any of this down? Marcus asked urgently. Harmon was quiet for a moment, then rose slowly and disappeared into the house, returning several minutes later with a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. I've kept records of every case I ever handled, he said, handing it over. Everything I found that day is written here, dated in my own hand. I always thought someone might need it someday. Marcus flipped through the pages with careful hands until he found the entry, and when he read it aloud, Clara felt the final piece of the puzzle slide into place with a certainty that sent a chill through her entire body. This is exactly what we need, Marcus said. A dated contemporaneous medical record describing physical evidence of tampering. Paired with your father's letter describing Ashford's fraud and your mother's confrontation with him just days before her death, this isn't circumstantial anymore, Caleb. This is a case. Will you testify? Caleb asked, turning to Harmon. In 4 days in Cheyenne. The old doctor looked at him for a long moment, something like relief crossing his weathered face. I should have testified 11 years ago. I let your father's grief talk me into silence, and I've regretted it every year since. Yes, I'll testify. Duh. They rode back through the night, the journal secured carefully in Marcus's saddlebag, exhaustion and adrenaline warring in every muscle of Clara's body. But even amid the relief of what they'd found, a new dread had settled over Caleb that Clara couldn't ignore. You're quiet, she said, as their horses fell into an easy rhythm, side by side on the dark trail. I keep thinking about her, Caleb admitted. My mother. 11 years I believed her death was simply bad luck. Now I know someone chose to take her from me, and the man responsible has been standing across a courtroom from me this entire time, threatening to use her memory as a weapon. Then we make sure he never gets the chance, Clara said. We take the weapon out of his hands before he can even raise it. You keep saying we, Caleb said quietly. Even after everything. Even after learning what this family truly is. Clara considered the question for a long moment before answering. I told you once that I hadn't decided if I was staying. I think somewhere between that mercantile ledger and Doc Harmon's porch, I stopped deciding and started simply being here. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it happened. Caleb reached across the space between their horses and found her hand in the darkness, and for the first time since the truth had first come apart at the mansion's edge, Clara let him hold it without pulling away. No. They arrived back at the mansion just before dawn, only to find Marcus waiting on the front steps with an expression that told Clara immediately something new had gone wrong. Ashford knows, Marcus said without preamble. About Doc Harmon, about the journal. I don't know how, but he knows and he's already moved. Moved how? Caleb demanded. He's filed a countersuit, Marcus said. Against Harmon directly. Claims the doctor is fabricating evidence out of some old grudge that the journal entry was written recently and backdated to support your case. He's trying to discredit the witness before he even takes the stand. That's absurd, Clara said. The journal is 11 years old. Any examiner could verify the age of the ink the paper. Ashford doesn't need it to hold up forever, Marcus said grimly. He only needs it to hold up long enough to create doubt in the judge's mind. Enough doubt and the whole case collapses under its own weight before we even get to present the fraud evidence. Caleb's expression had gone hard colder than Clara had ever seen it. Then we need an independent examiner. Someone Ashford can't buy, can't intimidate someone whose word a judge will trust without question. There's a man in Denver, Marcus said slowly. Forensic examiner works mostly with the railroad on fraud cases. Expensive. And even if we send for him today, there's no guarantee he arrives before the hearing. Send for him anyway, Caleb said. Whatever it costs. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation exhaustion and mounting tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the mansion. Clara barely slept, her mind cycling endlessly through every document, every testimony, every piece of the case they were building against a man who had already destroyed 2 families and possibly murdered a third. On the second night, unable to sleep, she found herself in the mansion's library, long after midnight, staring at the same ledger pages she'd already memorized, when Caleb appeared in the doorway, looking equally sleepless. "You should rest," he said. "4 days from now, none of this will matter if you're too exhausted to think clearly." "I could say the same to you," Clara said, setting down the ledger. "You've barely slept since Laramie." Caleb crossed the room and sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the exhaustion radiating off him in waves. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course." "If we win this, if Ashford is exposed, the estate is secured. All of this is finally settled. What happens to us? To what we're building, or trying to build in the middle of all this chaos?" Clara considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "that I fell in love with a poor cowboy who paid a doctor's bill without a second thought. I think somewhere along the way that cowboy turned out to be an heir to an empire, and I had to decide whether the man underneath all of it was still someone I wanted to build a life with." "And what did you decide?" Clara looked at him, and for the first time since the mansion had first come into view on that mountain trail, she let every wall she'd been holding up finally come down. "I decided he was," she said. "Mansion or cabin, wealthy or poor. I don't think it changes who you actually are underneath it, Caleb. I think I fell in love with that man a long time before I ever saw this house." Caleb's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of her words settling between them like something sacred. "I love you," he said finally quietly, like he'd been holding the words back for weeks, afraid to say them before he knew if she'd stay to hear them. "I have for longer than I let myself admit. I was terrified of what would happen the moment you saw all this." "I'm still here," Clara said softly. "Terrified or not, I'm still here." The forensic examiner arrived from Denver the following afternoon. A sharp-eyed man named Aldous Reyes, who spent nearly 6 hours examining Doc Harmon's journal with a meticulousness that left Clara's nerves frayed to their limit. "The ink is consistent with the paper's age," Reyes finally announced, setting the journal down. "No evidence of recent alteration. If Ashford's lawyers claim this was fabricated, I'll testify under oath that the science says otherwise." Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Reyes said. "I've dealt with men like Ashford before. He won't stop at discrediting a journal. If he's desperate enough, he'll find another angle entirely." Reyes's warning proved prophetic within a single day. Khan. The new threat arrived not through legal filings, but through Red Hollow itself. A rumor that spread through the town with a speed and viciousness that suggested it had been deliberately planted, carefully timed, to reach its peak right before the hearing. "They're saying you poisoned your own father," Marcus said grimly, delivering the news with visible disgust. "That the entire fraud case against Ashford is a fabrication designed to distract from your own crimes. Someone's been paying men in every saloon from here to Cheyenne to spread the story." "That's insane," Caleb said, his voice tight with fury. "My father died of illness. Half the doctors in this territory examined him before the end." "Insane doesn't matter if enough people believe it before the hearing," Marcus said. "Ashford's not fighting fair anymore, Caleb. He's fighting dirty, and he's fighting fast, because he knows the evidence we've gathered is strong enough to end him if it reaches that courtroom untouched." Clara felt fury rising in her chest, sharp and protective. "Then we need to get ahead of it. Before the hearing, before any more rumors spread." "How?" Caleb asked. "The families," Clara said. "The Coopers and the others who agreed to testify. If Ashford is trying to poison the well of public opinion, before we even reach Cheyenne, we counter it the same way. We let the truth reach Red Hollow before his lies finish spreading." It was a risk gathering the families publicly in the days before such a critical hearing, but Clara insisted, and within 2 days, a small assembly had formed at the Red Hollow Church, the very same church where Clara and Caleb had been married, under the pitying eyes of a town that believed him poor. This time the eyes watching them were different. Mrs. Cooper stood at the front of the gathering, her voice shaking but clear as she described the forged signatures on her family's loan documents. Two other families followed their stories, layering atop each other into an undeniable pattern. "I know some of you have heard rumors this week," Clara said, standing beside Caleb at the front of the small crowd, her voice steady, despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "About my husband. About his father. I understand why you might believe them. You've spent years believing this town's whispers were the truth about him, when in fact the truth was hiding in plain sight the entire time, protecting itself the only way it knew how." She looked out at the gathered townspeople, the same people who had once pitied her for marrying a poor cowboy, the same people who had whispered behind her back on her wedding day. "Caleb Whitmore did not poison his father," she said. "He did not orchestrate any fraud. The fraud belongs to a man named Charles Ashford, who has spent years destroying families exactly like the Coopers, exactly like mine, and who is now spreading lies about my husband, because the truth is finally catching up to him." A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertain but listening. "I came to this town believing I was marrying a poor man with nothing to offer but hard work and an honest heart," Clara continued. "I was wrong about the nothing. I was never wrong about the honest heart. Ask yourselves which story makes more sense, a man who spent years quietly paying doctor's bills and replacing lost cattle without ever seeking credit, or a man capable of murdering his own father for money he never even wanted people to know he had?" The silence that followed stretched long, and then slowly. Mrs. Griggs, the same woman who had once whispered pity about Caleb across the boardwalk, stepped forward. "I've known Caleb Whitmore his whole life," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small crowd. "Watched him grow up poor by choice apparently, though I never understood why until today. Never once in all those years did I see cruelty in that man. Only kindness, quiet as it was." Others began to nod, murmurs of agreement rippling through the gathering, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in days. Not victory yet, but the first real sign that the tide might be turning in their favor. But even as public opinion began to shift, Marcus arrived at the mansion that evening with news that stole every ounce of relief Clara had allowed herself to feel. "Ashford's made his final move," Marcus said, his face ashen. "He's subpoenaed Clara's testimony directly. Wants her on the stand under oath, questioned about her father's death and the circumstances of her arrival in Red Hollow." "That's his right," Caleb said carefully. "But surely our evidence outweighs." "There's more," Marcus said. "He's found a witness of his own, someone claiming to have knowledge of Clara's father's business dealings. Someone who might corroborate his claim that the family fraud ran both directions." Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her again. "Who?" Marcus hesitated, clearly reluctant to say the name, but the pressure of the moment left him no choice. "Your uncle," he said. "Harlan Bennett. Ashford found him in Missouri. He's agreed to testify against you." Clara's blood went cold. Harlan Bennett, her father's younger brother, a man she hadn't seen since childhood, a man whose relationship with her father had fractured so completely years before his death that Clara had barely thought of him since. "He hasn't spoken to my family in over a decade," she said, her voice unsteady. "Why would he suddenly resurface now testifying against me?" "Ashford's paying him," Caleb said grimly. "It's the only explanation that makes sense." "Then we need to know what he plans to say," Clara said, her mind already racing ahead, despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "Before he ever sets foot in that courtroom." Marcus managed to arrange a meeting the following day, a tense, uncomfortable encounter in a small hotel room in Cheyenne, where Harlan Bennett sat across from his niece for the first time in over a decade. Looking older and more worn than Clara remembered, his eyes shifting nervously between her and Caleb. "You look like your mother," Harlan said, finally breaking the silence. "You look like a man who sold out his own family for money," Clara said, her voice cold. "What is Ashford paying you to say, Uncle Harlan?" Harlan flinched at her directness, but didn't deny it. "He's offering enough to clear debts I've carried since before your father died. Enough to finally have something for myself after years of watching him get everything while you what?" Clara cut in. "While you abandoned your own brother when he needed you most. While you let a decade pass without a single letter, and now you're willing to lie about him in a courtroom for money." I'm not lying, Harlan said, though his voice wavered. Your father did make bad investments. He did lose everything through poor decisions. He lost everything to forged loan documents bearing a signature that wasn't his, Clara said, sliding the evidence across the table with hands that trembled with barely controlled fury. Look at this, Uncle Harlan. Really look at it. Is that our father's handwriting? Harlan stared at the documents for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes. Surprise, then dawning horror. Then something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. That's not his signature, he admitted quietly. I'd know his hand anywhere. This is forged. Then whatever Ashford is paying you to say, Caleb said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the room, is built on a lie you now know for certain. The question is whether you're willing to live with that Mr. Bennett for whatever price he's offered you. Harlan sat in silence for a long, agonizing moment, old grief and fresh guilt visibly warring across his weathered face. I loved my brother. He finally said, his voice breaking. I was too proud, too stubborn to reach out after we fought. And now Ashford's offering me money to speak against him, and God help me, I nearly said yes, because I hated myself too much to say no to easy money one more time. And now, Clara asked quietly. Harlan looked up at her, tears standing unshed in his tired eyes. Now I think I owe my brother's memory more than another betrayal. I'll testify, Clara. But not for Ashford, for the truth, whatever that costs me. They left the hotel room with something Clara hadn't expected to find in Cheyenne. Not just evidence against Ashford, but a fragile, unexpected reconciliation with a piece of her family she'd believed lost for good. But there was no time to dwell on it. The hearing was now only a single day away, and as they rode back toward the mansion in the fading evening light, Marcus delivered one final piece of news that made Clara's blood run cold all over again. Ashford's requested a private meeting, Marcus said. Tonight, just you two and him, no lawyers present. He says he has a final offer he wants to make directly. An offer to do what? Caleb asked, his jaw tight. I don't know, Marcus admitted. But knowing Ashford, it's either a last, desperate attempt at bribery or a threat so severe he doesn't want witnesses present when he delivers it. Clara looked at Caleb, and in his eyes, she saw the same grim determination she felt rising in her own chest. Then we go, she said. Tonight, because whatever Ashford has left to threaten us with, I'd rather face it directly than spend one more sleepless night wondering what he's planning next. Caleb reached for her hand, holding it tight, as their horses carried them toward a meeting that would decide in ways neither of them could yet fully imagine, whether the truth they'd fought so hard to uncover would finally see the inside of a courtroom, or whether Charles Ashford still had one final devastating card left to play. Ashford was waiting for them alone in a private room above the Cheyenne Hotel, seated at a small table with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and the moment Clara laid eyes on him, she understood immediately why her father had never stood a chance against this man. He had the kind of calm, practiced confidence that came from years of ruining people and never once being made to answer for it. Mrs. Whitmore, Ashford said, rising just enough to acknowledge her before settling back into his chair. You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for. The Cooper family, your uncle, Doc Harmon's journal. I'll admit I underestimated you. You underestimated a lot of people, Clara said, refusing the chair. He gestured toward choosing instead to stand beside Caleb. My father, the Coopers, every family whose signature you forged and whose life you destroyed for profit. Ashford's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes, irritation perhaps, or the first faint trace of fear. Strong accusations. I invited you here tonight because I thought we might avoid a courtroom spectacle that benefits no one. You mean a courtroom spectacle that exposes you, Caleb said flatly. I mean a courtroom that will drag both our families through mud neither of us wants stirred, Ashford said, his voice hardening slightly. You have your evidence. I have mine. Doc Harmon's journal will face intense scrutiny. Your uncle's testimony can be discredited as a bitter man seeking revenge for old grievances. And Mrs. Whitmore's father's death will be re-examined in ways that may not paint him as favorably as she'd like. You forged his signature, Clara said, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. You destroyed his life, and now you're threatening to smear what little dignity is left of his memory. I'm offering you a choice, Ashford said calmly. Withdraw your testimonies. Let the anniversary clause stand unchallenged. Caleb keeps his estate quietly, without further scrutiny, into his mother's death, and I walk away from all of this without further complication. Everyone wins. Everyone except every family you've defrauded, Caleb said. Everyone except my mother, whose death you're still trying to bury under threats even now. Ashford's composure finally cracked just slightly, a flash of something cold and dangerous passing behind his eyes. Your mother's death was investigated and closed 11 years ago, Mr. Whitmore. I'd be very careful about the accusations you choose to make in a room with no witnesses. The threat hung heavy in the air, and Clara felt Caleb's hand tighten around hers. Is that a confession? Caleb asked quietly. That, Ashford said, standing slowly, is a warning. Withdraw your case, or I promise you both what happens in that courtroom tomorrow will destroy far more than my reputation. He left without another word, and Clara and Caleb stood alone in the small room for a long moment, the weight of his threat settling heavy over both of them. He's afraid, Clara said finally. Did you see it? Just for a second when you mentioned your mother directly? He's afraid of exactly what we already know. Then tomorrow? Caleb said, his jaw set with a determination Clara hadn't seen from him before. We make sure that fear becomes his downfall. Ken. They barely slept that night, the weight of the coming hearing pressing down on both of them with a suffocating intensity that made every hour feel like borrowed time. Clara spent the small hours reviewing every document one final time, cross-referencing every date, every name, every forged signature, until the words blurred together, and Caleb finally pulled the papers gently from her hands. You've done everything you can, he said softly. Tomorrow, we let the truth speak for itself. What if it isn't enough? Clara asked, her voice small in the darkness. What if Ashford finds some way to twist all of this, the way he's twisted everything else? Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful seriousness he gave everything. Then we lose the estate, he said finally. The land, the mansion, all of it. But Clara, I want you to hear this clearly. None of that is what I'm afraid of losing tomorrow. Then what? You, he said simply. If this goes badly, if Ashford manages to twist the story enough to make you look complicit in something you never did. I'm afraid of what that does to us. To whatever we've built these last few months. Clara reached for his hand in the darkness. Whatever happens tomorrow, Caleb, I'm not walking away from you. Not because of the estate. Because of everything we just went through to get here. The Cheyenne courthouse was already crowded by the time they arrived the next morning, word of the hearing having spread through the territory with a speed that suggested Ashford's rumors had done exactly what he'd intended, drawn an audience hungry for scandal, ready to believe the worst about a family that had spent years hiding behind quiet poverty. Clara felt every eye in the room as she and Caleb took their seats, the whispers rising and falling around them like a tide she couldn't escape. That's her, the mail-order bride. Heard she's the one who found the fraud evidence herself. Heard her own father was a criminal, whatever that means for her. She kept her chin lifted, her spine straight, refusing to let the whispers reach whatever fragile courage she'd built over the last several days. The judge, a stern-faced man named Harrington, who Marcus had warned them, showed little patience for theatrics, called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of his gavel, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Ashford's lawyer rose first, laying out his case with practiced precision, questioning the timing of Clara's marriage, suggesting financial motive, hinting at fraud on both sides of the family history. Building toward the anniversary clause, and the argument that the entire marriage had been engineered for exactly the convenient timing Reeves had first suggested weeks earlier. The prosecution will show, the lawyer said, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom, that this marriage was arranged not out of genuine affection, but out of legal necessity, timed precisely to preserve an inheritance that would otherwise have transferred to a board of trustees. We will further show that Mrs. Whitmore's own family history includes financial impropriety that calls her character and her motives seriously into question. Clara felt her stomach twist, but she forced herself to remain still, remembering everything she and Caleb had built over the past several days. Marcus rose next calm and measured, and began laying out their defense with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly how much rested on every word. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "the prosecution paints a picture of convenient timing and financial motive. What the prosecution fails to mention is that the very foundation of their case, the accusation against Mrs. Whitmore's father, rests on forged documents. Documents forged by the same man bringing this case before you today." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Ashford's composed expression flickered for just a moment. Marcus called Mrs. Cooper to the stand first, her testimony steady, despite her visible nerves describing the forged loan documents that had destroyed her family's finances. Then came the second family, then the third, each testimony building on the last painting, an unmistakable pattern of fraud that stretched back years. Ashford's lawyer objected repeatedly, but Judge Harrington allowed each testimony to stand, his expression growing more skeptical of Ashford with every witness who took the stand. Then Marcus called Doc Harmon. The old doctor moved slowly to the stand, but his voice when he spoke carried a clarity and conviction that silenced the room entirely. "I examined Mrs. Whitmore's mare after her fatal fall 11 years ago." Harmon said, his eyes steady despite his age. "I found a fresh puncture wound beneath the saddle blanket consistent with something sharp deliberately used to spook the animal. I recorded my findings that same day in a journal I have kept for over 30 years of medical practice." Ashford's lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, this journal has not been independently verified. We have reason to believe it was fabricated recently to support a fraudulent claim." "Your Honor," Marcus said calmly, "I'd like to call forensic examiner Aldous Reyes, who has independently verified the age and authenticity of the journal entry in question." Reyes took the stand and delivered his findings with the same meticulous precision he'd shown at the mansion days earlier, and Clara watched Ashford's expression shift from calm to something visibly strained as the evidence mounted against him, testimony after testimony, document after document, until the courtroom's collective doubt began tipping unmistakably in their favor. But the true turning point came when Marcus called Harlan Bennett to the stand. Clara watched her uncle rise from his seat in the gallery, his steps hesitant, but his shoulders squared with a determination that surprised her. He'd told her he would testify for the truth, whatever it cost him. And as he settled into the witness chair, Clara realized she believed him completely. "Mr. Bennett," Marcus began, "you were originally approached by the defense to testify against your niece, is that correct?" "Yes," Harlan said, his voice steady, despite the visible discomfort of the admission. "Mr. Ashford's associates offered me a significant sum to testify that my brother's financial ruin was the result of his own criminal fraud rather than the fraud of another party." "And why did you decline that offer?" Harlan looked directly at Ashford as he answered, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Because when I examined the documents Mrs. Whitmore showed me, I recognized immediately that my brother's signature had been forged. I know my own brother's handwriting, Your Honor. I've known it my entire life. Whatever guilt I carry for the years I stayed silent after our falling out, I refuse to add to it by lying about him now for any amount of money." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Harrington had to rap his gavel twice to restore order. Ashford's lawyer attempted one final line of questioning, pressing Harlan about his motives, suggesting his testimony was simply an attempt to reconcile with a family he'd abandoned. But Harlan held firm, and by the time he stepped down from the stand, Clara could see, even from across the room, that something in Judge Harrington's expression had shifted entirely. Ashford's lawyer called his own witnesses next, attempting to salvage what remained of their case, but each testimony seemed to unravel further under Marcus's careful cross-examination, until finally the moment Clara had been dreading since the private meeting the night before finally arrived. "The defense calls Charles Ashford himself," his lawyer announced, and Clara felt Caleb's entire body tense beside her. Ashford took the stand with his usual composed confidence, but as Marcus began his cross-examination, that composure began slowly and unmistakably to crack. Mr. Ashford, Marcus began, you've testified that Mrs. Whitmore's father engaged in fraudulent business practices that led to his own financial ruin. Can you explain why 3 separate loan documents bearing his signature show handwriting inconsistent with verified samples of his actual signature? I can't speak to variations in a man's handwriting, Ashford said carefully. Can you explain, Marcus continued, why the Cooper family, the Hendricks family, and the Whitfield family all describe nearly identical circumstances, forged signatures on loan documents originating from Ashford Trust and Lending, followed by financial ruin and land seizure? Coincidence, Ashford said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. 4 families, Mr. Ashford. The same forged handwriting, the same lending institution, the same pattern of ruin. That's a remarkable coincidence. Ashford said nothing, his jaw tight, and Marcus pressed forward without mercy. Let's discuss Mrs. Whitmore's mother, Marcus said, and the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward at once. Doc Harmon's testimony, corroborated by independent forensic analysis, suggests her fatal accident was not an accident at all, but a deliberate act. Can you explain why 3 days before her death, she confronted you directly about the fraud she had discovered in your business dealings? I have no knowledge of any such confrontation, Ashford said, but his voice wavered now, sweat visible at his temple despite the cool morning air. You have no knowledge, Marcus repeated slowly, of a conversation that occurred at your own office 3 days before Mrs. Whitmore's mother died, under circumstances a forensic examiner has now confirmed were consistent with deliberate tampering. I want my lawyer to advise me before I answer further questions, Ashford said abruptly, and the shift in his demeanor sent a ripple of understanding through the entire courtroom. Judge Harrington's expression had gone from skeptical to something far colder, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the full weight of judicial authority. Mr. Ashford, you are reminded that you remain under oath. The court will take a brief recess, after which I expect complete and honest answers to counsel's questions, or I will hold you in contempt and refer this matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal investigation. The recess felt endless. Clara paced the small hallway outside the courtroom, her nerves stretched to their absolute limit while Caleb stood silent beside her, his own composure clearly fraying at the edges. He's going to break, Clara said finally. Did you see his face? He knows Marcus has him cornered. I hope you're right, Caleb said quietly. Because if he doesn't, if he finds some way to twist his way out of this, he won't, Clara said, though she wasn't entirely certain she believed it herself. The evidence is too strong. Too many families, too many documents, too much truth stacked against him now. When the hearing resumed, Ashford's composure had visibly deteriorated, his earlier confidence replaced by something brittle and defensive. Mr. Ashford. Marcus continued, his voice calm but relentless. I'll ask you again. Did you have any knowledge of a confrontation between yourself and Elizabeth Whitmore 3 days before her death? Ashford's hands trembled slightly on the arms of the witness chair. She came to my office, he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. She'd found discrepancies in some loan documents. She threatened to expose me. The courtroom erupted into sound, and Judge Harrington had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. And what happened after that confrontation? Marcus pressed. I told her I would review the discrepancies. Ashford said, his voice growing quieter. I told her it was likely a clerical error. Was it a clerical error? Ashford was silent for a long moment, the entire courtroom holding its breath. No, he finally admitted, and the words seemed to break something loose inside him. Years of careful lies finally collapsing under the weight of a single truth. It wasn't an error. I had been forging signatures for years. She found proof. I couldn't let her expose me. Did you arrange for her horse to be tampered with? Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet now. Ashford's face had gone pale, his hands shaking visibly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. I didn't do it myself, he said. I paid someone. I never meant for it to. He stopped himself, seeming to realize too late exactly what he'd just confessed to an entire courtroom full of witnesses. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters and spectators alike shouting questions, Judge Harrington banging his gavel with increasing force, and through it all, Clara felt Caleb's hand grip hers so tightly it nearly hurt 11 years of buried grief and unanswered questions finally finding their resolution in a single, devastating confession. Judge Harrington's ruling, when it finally came, left no room for ambiguity. This court finds, he announced, his voice carrying easily through the now silent room, that Charles Ashford has engaged in systematic financial fraud spanning multiple families across this territory, and has confessed under oath to arranging the death of Elizabeth Whitmore 11 years ago. This court further finds that the marriage between Caleb Whitmore and Clara Bennett was entered into in good faith, with no fraudulent intent, and the anniversary clause in question stands satisfied. The Whitmore estate remains fully and legally in the possession of Caleb Whitmore, without further challenge from this or any related party. He paused, looking directly at Ashford, who sat slumped and broken in the witness chair, the confident businessman who had walked into that courtroom, now reduced to something small and defeated. Charles Ashford is remanded into custody pending full criminal investigation into fraud and the death of Elizabeth Whitmore. Bail is denied. The gavel fell one final time, and the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of sound reporters shouting questions, spectators murmuring in shock, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Clara felt Caleb pull her into an embrace so fierce it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "Clara, it's actually over." "Your mother," Clara said softly, pulling back just enough to look at him. "After 11 years, she finally has justice." Caleb's eyes were wet, though he made no attempt to hide it. Not anymore. Not in front of a courtroom. Not in front of the entire territory that had spent years believing him nothing but a poor cowboy with nothing to offer. "Because of you," he said. "None of this happens without you, Clara. The Ledgers, the families, Doc Harmon, your uncle. Every piece of this case exists because you refuse to sit quietly and let the truth stay buried." They stepped out of the Cheyenne courthouse into an afternoon sun that felt different, somehow lighter, as if the entire weight of the last several weeks had finally lifted from both their shoulders. Marcus followed close behind, his own relief evident in every line of his exhausted face. "There's still work ahead," Marcus said. Ashford's trial, the criminal proceedings, restitution for the families he defrauded. But the estate is secure, Caleb. Completely legally secure. "Then let's begin making it right," Caleb said. "Every family Ashford ruined. The Coopers, the others. We start restitution immediately." "That's not a legal obligation," Marcus pointed out. "No," Caleb agreed. "It's a moral one." Clara looked at him, something warm and proud swelling in her chest, watching the man she'd married reveal once again exactly the kind of person he'd always been beneath every layer of hidden wealth and careful disguise. They rode back toward Red Hollow as the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, and when they finally crested the ridge that overlooked the valley, the same ridge where Clara had first seen the mansion, first learned the truth about the man she'd married, she found herself looking at it differently now. Not as a symbol of secrets and hidden lies, but as something that finally truly belonged to both of them. "Home," Caleb said quietly, following her gaze toward the mansion in the distance. "Home," Clara agreed, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach into a town full of whispers and pity, the word felt entirely, completely true. But even as relief settled deep into her bones, even as the valley stretched golden and peaceful beneath the setting sun, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that one final conversation still waited for them at the top of that hill. A conversation about everything that had happened, everything they'd learned about each other, and everything that still remained to be decided about the life they were choosing to build together. The ride back to the mansion carried a silence between them that felt different from every silence before it. Not the tense quiet of secrets withheld, but something softer, something that needed no words to fill it. Yet the moment they reached the front steps, Marcus was waiting again, and one look at his face told Clara that peace even now would have to wait a little longer. "There's a wire from Cheyenne," Marcus said, holding out a folded paper. "Arrived an hour ago." Caleb took it, unfolding it with hands that had only just stopped shaking from the courtroom. Clara watched his face carefully as he read, and when his jaw tightened, her stomach dropped in anticipation of one more blow. Neither of them had the strength left to absorb. "What is it?" she asked. "Ashford's lawyers," Caleb said slowly. "They're filing an appeal, claiming the confession was coerced, that Judge Harrington's courtroom conduct was prejudicial, that the entire ruling should be thrown out pending a new hearing." Clara felt fury rise hot and immediate in her chest. He confessed, in front of an entire courtroom under oath. How can there be grounds for appeal? "Money buys creative lawyers," Marcus said grimly. "It won't succeed, Caleb. The confession stands, the criminal charges stand, but it means Ashford's associates aren't finished trying to make this as difficult as possible. There may be more filings, more delays, more attempts to drag this out." Caleb exhaled slowly, and Clara watched some of the light that had returned to his eyes in the courthouse begin to dim again beneath the weight of yet another fight. "Let them file," Caleb said finally. "Let them appeal. Let them spend every dollar they have left trying to undo what an entire courtroom witnessed with their own ears. It won't change what happened to my mother. It won't unmake what he confessed to doing." "No," Marcus agreed. "It won't, but it may take months before the criminal trial concludes. Ashford will remain in custody, but the appeals process will run its course." Caleb interrupted, quieter now, more certain. "I've spent 11 years living in the shadow of unanswered questions, Marcus. I can survive a few more months of legal maneuvering while the truth finishes settling into place. What I can't survive is losing sight of what actually matters while I'm fighting it." He turned to Clara, and something in his expression had shifted. Not the exhaustion of a man still bracing for the next blow, but the quiet resolve of someone finally choosing deliberately what to hold on to. "Which is you," he said simply. "Whatever else Ashford's lawyers throw at us in the coming months, I don't intend to spend another day of it uncertain about where I stand with you." Wow. Marcus left them not long after, promising to handle whatever fresh filings arrived, and to bring only what truly required their attention. And for the first time in what felt like months, the mansion settled into something resembling quiet. Clara found Caleb that evening on the same balcony where they'd first stood together after the truth had come apart at the seams. Weeks earlier, the valley spread golden beneath the last hour of daylight, cattle grazing in the distance, as though nothing in the world had changed at all. "I keep thinking about her," Caleb said before Clara had even fully joined him at the railing. "My mother. All these years I built a life around avoiding the truth of what happened to her without even knowing what that truth actually was. Now that I finally know, I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to know right away," Clara said gently. "Grief doesn't work on anyone's schedule but its own." "She would have liked you," Caleb said quietly. "I don't remember much about her, honestly. I was so young. But I remember she never cared much for the things this house represented. She used to say the land only mattered because of the people who worked it, not because of what it was worth on paper." "She sounds like someone I would have liked very much too," Clara said. Caleb turned to face her fully, then something raw and unguarded moving across his features. "I've been thinking about something else too. Something I should have said the moment I brought you up this mountain the first time, instead of letting Reeves and Ashford and every complication since interrupt it." "What's that?" "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for the estate, not for the mansion, or the wealth, or any of the things Ashford tried to twist into weapons against us. I'm sorry for the 2 months I let you believe you'd married a man with nothing, when the truth is I had everything, and I was too afraid to trust you with it." Clara considered his words for a long moment, the evening breeze carrying the scent of the valley up to where they stood. "I understand why you did it," she said finally. "I even understand the fear underneath it now that I know what happened to your mother. But Caleb, I need you to hear something clearly, the same way you asked me to hear you clearly that first difficult night in this house. Anything. I don't ever want to build a marriage on hidden rooms," she said. Not literal ones, and not the kind we carry inside ourselves either. Whatever comes next, Ashford's appeals the estate the families were helping rebuild. I need you to choose honesty with me every single day, even when it's harder than silence. I promise you that, Caleb said without a single moment of hesitation. Every day for as long as you'll have me. The weeks that followed brought a strange, hard-won rhythm to their lives. Not the simple poverty Clara had first believed she was marrying into, and not the isolated secrecy Caleb had spent years hiding behind, but something new entirely built from the wreckage of both. They began as Caleb had promised in the courthouse with restitution. The Coopers received the first payment enough to reclaim the acres Ashford had stolen from them years before, and Clara watched Mrs. Cooper weep openly on their porch, gripping Clara's hands so tightly it nearly hurt. "I never thought I'd see this land again," Mrs. Cooper said. "Never thought anyone would believe us, let alone fight for us." "You fought for yourselves," Clara said. "We only helped carry it the last distance." The Hendricks family came next. Then the Whitfields, each restoration bringing with it a small growing sense in Red Hollow that something fundamental about the town had shifted, not just the fortunes of a few wronged families, but the entire understanding of who Caleb Whitmore truly was. Never would have believed it. Old man Griggs admitted to Caleb one afternoon in the Mercantile, the same man who had mocked him outside the bank months earlier. Poorest cowboy in the territory turns out to be the richest man in 3 counties and spends every bit of it making right what another man broke. "I'm not interested in being called rich or poor," Caleb said. "I'm interested in being the kind of man my father would have been proud of if he'd found the courage to fight this battle himself instead of hiding from it for 11 years. Griggs studied him for a long moment, something like genuine respect crossing his weathered face. "Well, for what it's worth, son, I think you've become exactly that." Clara's Uncle Harlan stayed in the territory longer than any of them expected. Drawn back, it seemed, by the fragile reconciliation that had begun in that tense hotel room in Cheyenne. He visited the mansion twice in the following month, each time a little less guarded, a little more willing to speak about the brother he'd lost to years of stubborn silence. "I should have written to him," Harlan admitted during one visit sitting across from Clara in the mansion's library, a place that had come to feel less intimidating to her with every passing week. "Every year that passed, I told myself there'd be time later, and then there wasn't." "You're here now," Clara said. "That has to count for something." "It counts for you," Harlan said. "Whether it counts for him, I suppose I'll never know for certain. But testifying in that courtroom, refusing Ashford's money, telling the truth, even though it cost me the easy way out, that felt like the first honest thing I've done in his memory in over a decade." Clara reached across the table and took her uncle's hand, something in her chest settling that had been unsettled since her father's death. "He would have forgiven you," she said. "I know he would have. He forgave almost everyone eventually. It was one of the things that made him easy to take advantage of, and one of the things that made him impossible not to love." Harlan's eyes glistened, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of years of silence finally quietly beginning to lift. Ashford's appeal, as Marcus had predicted, ultimately went nowhere. The confession stood. The criminal trial proceeded with the same overwhelming evidence that had already destroyed his credibility in the civil hearing, and within 2 months, Charles Ashford was convicted on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy in the death of Elizabeth Whitmore, sentenced to the full extent the territorial court allowed. Caleb received the news from Marcus with a quiet, contained relief that Clara recognized immediately, not celebration, not vindication exactly, but the particular stillness of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried since childhood. "It doesn't bring her back," he said that evening, standing once again on the balcony that had become, in some unspoken way, the place where they processed everything too large to hold anywhere else. "No," Clara agreed. "But it means the truth finally has the final word. That matters, Caleb. Even 11 years late, it matters." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade across the valley. "My father wrote in that letter that he never had the courage to use the weapon of Ashford's guilt against him. I keep thinking about that. How much pain might have been prevented, how many other families might have been spared if he'd found that courage sooner. You can't carry his choices, Clara said gently. Only your own. And you chose eventually to do exactly what he couldn't. With your help, Caleb said. I want to be honest about that too, the way I promised. None of this happens without you, Clara. Not the evidence, not the courtroom, not any of it. We did this together, Clara said. I think that's the only way anything this difficult ever gets done. As autumn settled over the valley, bringing with it the first cool edges of the coming winter life at the mansion began to find a steadiness Clara had never quite believed possible after everything they'd endured. The workers who tended the land began greeting her by name with a warmth that had nothing to do with her position as Caleb's wife and everything to do with the woman who had ridden alongside him through every difficult mile of the fight against Ashford. Mrs. Whitmore, one of the ranch hands said one morning, tipping his hat as she crossed the yard. Heard the Whitfield restitution went through this week. It did, Clara said, smiling. Full acreage returned plus the 2 years of lost income Ashford's fraud cost them. Word's spreading fast, the hand said. Folks are saying there's never been a family in this territory that's done more good with their fortune than the Whitmores have this year. Clara carried that thought with her the rest of the day, turning it over like something precious. She thought of the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach months earlier, believing she was marrying a poor man out of desperate necessity, believing her own worth had been reduced to whatever survival she could manage. She barely recognized that woman anymore. That evening, she found Caleb in the study, going over the quarter's accounts, with the same careful attention he gave every decision that touched the land his father had built. I've been thinking, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. About what comes next. Ashford's trial is finished. The families are being made whole. Your mother finally has justice, however incomplete it feels. What happens now? Caleb, what do we build once all the fighting is finally behind us? Caleb set down his pen, considering the question with the same seriousness he gave everything important. I've been thinking about that too, he admitted. I don't want this place to only be remembered for the fraud it survived or the secrets it once hid. I want it to become something my father would recognize, a place built for the people who work it, not just the family who owns it. What does that look like? A school, perhaps, Caleb said slowly, the idea clearly taking shape as he spoke it aloud for the first time. For the children of every family working this land, rich or poor, Whitmore or otherwise. My father always said the land only mattered because of the people who worked it. I'd like to prove he meant that in a way people can actually see. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest watching the man across from her. No longer the poor cowboy. Red Hollow once pitied, no longer the guarded heir hiding behind rags and quiet suffering, but someone finally fully himself, building towards something larger than either grief or fortune alone could have created. I think that's exactly the kind of thing your mother would have wanted, she said softly. I think so too, Caleb said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his smile carried no shadow of hidden weight behind it at all. Winter arrived early that year, the first snow dusting the valley in a soft white blanket that transformed the mansion's grounds into something that looked to Clara's eyes almost impossibly beautiful. She stood at the same balcony one evening, watching snow settle over pastures where cattle huddled together against the cold, and felt Caleb's arms wrap around her from behind before she'd even heard him approach. Do you ever miss it? She asked, pretending to be poor. The simple cabin, the quiet anonymity of being just another struggling rancher in Red Hollow. Caleb considered the question seriously, resting his chin against her shoulder as they both looked out over the snow-dusted valley. Sometimes, he admitted. There was a simplicity to it, no one expecting anything from me beyond an honest day's work. Why? Clara asked, echoing, though she didn't realize it yet, almost the exact question she would ask him again months into their future in a moment that would feel like both an ending and a beginning. Because that was when I learned who truly saw me, Caleb said. Before any of this, he gestured at the mansion, the valley, the vast fortune stretching in every direction beneath the snow. Before any of it mattered to anyone. I learned exactly what I was worth to the people around me. Very little most days, if we're speaking honestly. But the one person who saw something worth staying for even then, that person turned out to be worth more than every acre my father ever owned. Clara turned in his arms to face him, snow beginning to fall softly around them both. And what did you learn from all of it? The hiding, the courtroom, everything Ashford tried to take from us. Caleb's expression softened into something Clara had come to recognize as entirely uniquely his own. A quiet certainty that had nothing left to hide behind and no reason left to. That the right person doesn't fall in love with what you have, he said. They fall in love with who you are long before they ever learn what that is worth on paper. I spent years afraid of exactly that truth, Clara. I don't think I'll ever be afraid of it again. Clara held his hand tightly, snow gathering softly in her hair, the valley stretching silent and white beneath the darkening sky, and felt for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach into a town full of whispers. Something that finally completely resembled home. The Cowboy. Everyone in Red Hollow had once dismissed as the poorest man in the territory, had spent years protecting a secret mansion built from his father's hard-won legacy. But in the end, after every lie uncovered, every family made whole, every shadow of his mother's death finally brought into the light, the greatest fortune Caleb Whitmore ever discovered was not the land beneath his feet, nor the wealth his father had built across 30,000 acres. It was the woman who had chosen him before she ever knew he owned any of it, and who had never once in all the months that followed given him a single reason to doubt that her love had always been real. Because true love does not search for a fortune. It recognizes a heart, and once it finds one worth keeping, it never lets go again.